The man who shared the first story online went by the username Nightwalker_88. He worked security at a large distribution warehouse on the outskirts of his city. He had taken the job because the pay was decent, and in his own words, he liked the quiet. He would soon come to regret those words. The warehouse was enormous, row after row of metal shelving stretching up toward the ceiling, pallets of boxed goods stacked 6, 7 feet high, forklifts parked in their bays like sleeping animals. During the day, dozens of workers moved through that space. At night, it was just him. His routine was simple. Every hour on the hour he walked the floor, every aisle, every corner. He checked the loading bays, the emergency exits, the break room, and the cold storage unit at the back. A large walk-in freezer used to store temperature-sensitive goods. He had done this walk hundreds of times. He knew every creak of the floor, every flicker of the overhead lights, every sound the building made when it settled in the cold night air. He thought he knew everything that warehouse could throw at him. He was wrong. It was a Tuesday night in late November. He had just finished his second patrol of the evening, approximately 11 p.m., and returned to his desk near the main entrance. He made himself a coffee, logged his check in the security register, and settled in with a book. The first hours passed without incident. Then came 3 a.m. He stood, stretched, and began his patrol. Aisle 1, Aisle 2, loading bay doors, secure. Emergency exits, secure. He moved to the back of the building toward the break room and the walk-in freezer. That is when he heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, evenly spaced, coming from inside the freezer door. He stopped walking. His hand tightened around his flashlight. He stood there in the dark corridor listening, telling himself it was the pipes, the cooling system, metal contracting in the cold, any one of 100 rational explanations. Then it came again. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same pace, like someone, or something, calmly and patiently requesting to be let in. He approached the door. The temperature around the freezer unit was noticeably colder than the rest of the warehouse, which was expected. But something about the air in that corridor felt different. Thicker, like the darkness itself was pressing in around him. He checked the door. It was closed. He checked the seal. It was intact. He had confirmed on his previous patrol, less than 2 hours ago, that the freezer was completely empty. His hand found the handle. He opened the door. Cold air flooded out. His flashlight swept the interior. Metal shelving, a few remaining pallets of goods, frost building on the walls. Nothing. No one. He stood in the open doorway for a long moment, the freezer light flickering weakly above him. Then he shut the door, walked back to his desk, and wrote it down in his log. Unexplained sound. Cold storage unit. 3:12 a.m. He told himself he would report it to management in the morning. He went back to his book. At 4 a.m., he stood for his next patrol. He walked the aisles. Loading bay doors. Secure. Emergency exits. Secure. He turned down the corridor toward the break room. The freezer door was open, not wide open, not as though someone had thrown it wide, just slightly ajar, a few inches, just enough that the cold air crept silently out into the corridor and curled around his ankles like something alive. He was certain he had shut it on his last round. He remembered the sound of the handle clicking back into place. Heart hammering, he approached, pushed the door fully open with his foot, swept the interior with his flashlight, and on the floor, directly in the center of the freezer, were 2 footprints, fresh ones, pressed into a thin layer of frost that had built up on the floor since his last check. Small footprints, bare feet, facing the door. He backed out of that freezer, radioed his supervisor, and refused to complete the remainder of his shift alone. He never worked at that warehouse again. No explanation was ever found for the footprints. The freezer had been locked from the outside, and no one had entered that building since his shift began. That warehouse is still operating today. They still run a night shift, and according to a follow-up post made by Nightwalker_88 nearly a year later, the security company that replaced him had introduced a strict new policy. No guard was permitted to patrol the cold storage corridor alone. No explanation was ever given to staff. The second story was shared in a Reddit thread, asking night shift workers to describe the most disturbing thing they had ever witnessed on the job. Among hundreds of responses, this one stood out. The man, who chose to remain anonymous, was 24 years old when it happened. He worked as security at a small private nursing home. It was a quiet facility, mostly elderly residents, many with advanced dementia. The night shift was largely uneventful. His job was to sit at the nurses' station between rounds, log any unusual activity, and assist staff if needed. He had worked there for about 3 months when it happened. He describes that particular night as especially still. No storms outside, no restless residents. The hallways were dark and quiet, doors closed, the only sound the occasional soft beep of a monitor somewhere down the corridor. It was approaching 2 a.m. He was at his desk, reading when he became aware of something in his peripheral vision. He looked up. At the far end of the hallway, standing completely still in the dark, was one of the elderly residents, a woman he rarely saw. She almost never left her room. She had severe dementia, late stage, and was largely non-verbal. He had been told during his orientation that she was mostly confined to her bed and required full care assistance to move. She was standing, upright, in the middle of the hallway, in her nightgown. He could not explain it. Not the fact that she was standing, not the fact that she had gotten out of her room, not the fact that she was completely motionless in the dark, staring not at him, but past him. At the window behind his desk, he started to rise from his chair to go to her. That was when she raised her arm, slowly, like a woman moving underwater. Her pale arm lifted until her finger pointed directly at the window behind him, and then she screamed. Not a cry, not a sob. A full, raw, blood-curdling scream that ripped through that silent hallway like a blade. Omega! Omega! He describes the sound as something he has never in his life been able to adequately put into words. Not the volume, though the volume alone was shocking, coming from a woman of her age and condition. It was the quality of it. Like grief and terror and recognition all collapsed into a single sound, like someone screaming the name of the most important person they had ever lost. He was frozen. He is not ashamed to admit it. He was 24 years old, alone in a dark nursing home corridor at 2 a.m., and a woman who should not have been able to stand was pointing at the window and screaming a single word into the dark with the full force of her lungs. He could not move. A night nurse came running from the far wing and gently guided the woman back to her room, speaking softly, one hand on her shoulder. The screaming stopped the moment the nurse touched her. She went quietly, like a candle being snuffed out. He sat back down, His hands were shaking. The nurse came back out a few minutes later. She took one look at his face and sat down across from him. She told him, very calmly, that Omega was the name of the woman's sister, her sister who had died 40 years ago. He nodded, thanked the nurse, waited until she walked away. Then he sat in that empty hallway for 2 hours trying to work out a rational explanation for what he had just witnessed. He is still working on it. Because here is the part of his story that he saved for the end of his post. The part that, even now, he says he cannot explain. He had been sitting at that desk, with his back to the window all night. He had not looked at the window, not once. But when he finally turned around, after the woman had been taken back to her room, after the nurse had explained about the sister, after he had sat alone in the silence of that hallway for 2 hours, he finally turned around and looked at the window. There were 2 handprints on the glass. On the outside, the nursing home was on the 2nd floor. He resigned 2 weeks later, not because of that night specifically, he said, but because after that night, every time he sat down at that desk, he found he could not stop himself from looking at the window, and he was terrified of what he might eventually see looking back. The 3rd story is perhaps the most methodical of the 3. The author identified himself only as a security guard at a large industrial site, the kind with multiple buildings, vast outdoor areas, camera systems, and a rotating team of guards. It began with a handover. At the start of his shift one evening, the outgoing guard, a veteran of the site who had worked there for years, pulled him aside before clocking out. He was clearly unsettled. He told the new guard that he needed to show him something. He led him to a specific stretch of path between 2 of the larger buildings, a section that formed part of the standard patrol route, and there, standing upright in the center of the path, was a doll, a child's doll, old-looking, porcelain face, dark hair, standing perfectly balanced on its own 2 feet in the middle of an industrial site at night, with no explanation for how it had gotten there. The outgoing guard told him he had found it 3 nights in a row. Each time he had moved it, kicked it off the path, placed it against a wall, once thrown it into a skip bin, and each time, by his next patrol, it had returned, not to the exact same spot, but always on that same stretch of path, always standing upright, always facing the direction of travel along the patrol route, like it was waiting for him. The new guard listened to all of this and did what most rational people would do. He told himself the outgoing guard was pulling his leg, a prank, something to spook the new guy on his first proper solo shift. He went out on his first patrol, and sure enough, there was the doll, right where he had been told, standing in the path. He kicked it aside into the shadow of the nearest building and carried on. 3 hours later, 2nd patrol. The doll was back, different position along the same stretch of path, still upright, still facing the direction he walked. He picked it up this time, looked at it. Porcelain face, cracked slightly around one cheek, glass eyes that caught the light in a way that made them look almost wet. He carried it all the way to the far end of the site and left it propped against the perimeter fence. 3rd patrol, 3 a.m. The doll was back on the path. He went directly to the control room and pulled up the camera footage covering that stretch of the site. He sat with his partner, and they watched the footage together, scanning through the timestamps, and there it was, a motion alert, triggered At 2:47 a.m., the camera covering that exact section of path. They scrubbed back to that timestamp and watched. The footage was dark. The camera resolution was not high enough to make out fine detail at that distance, and the lighting in that section of the site was poor. Just a single overhead lamp casting a pale yellow pool on the ground, about 10 meters from where the doll had been placed. But something had triggered that motion sensor. Something had moved. They watched the footage 3 times. And here is what they could and could not confirm. They could confirm that at 2:47 a.m., something moved in that section of the path. They could not confirm what it was. The movement was low to the ground, small, and it moved slowly. Not the quick darting movement of an animal, not the stumbling movement of a person, but a slow, steady, deliberate movement from one side of the path to the center, exactly where the doll had been found. He posted updates to the thread for 6 more weeks. In that time, the doll appeared 17 more times, always on the same stretch of path, always upright, always facing the direction of his patrol. He reviewed camera footage on 4 separate occasions when the motion sensors triggered during his shift. Each time, the same result. Something moved. Low to the ground. Slow. Deliberate. The footage never clear enough to identify what it was. On the final night described in his posts, he arrived at the stretch of path for his routine patrol and found the doll in its usual position. But this time, it was different. This time, the doll was facing the other direction. He never posted again after that update. His account was deleted 3 days later. The industrial site was never identified. Attempts by other users to trace the account came up empty. Whether a doll truly moved 17 times across 6 weeks on a monitored industrial site, I cannot say for certain. What I can tell ya is this: 3 security guards, 3 separate locations, 3 separate nights, all encountered something during the quiet hours that they could not explain. Something that waited for the dark. Something that only moved when the rest of the world was asleep. And all 3 of them walked away from their jobs not long after. This has been Sir Cold Case. If these stories kept you up tonight, good. That means you were paying attention. Until next time, stay sharp, stay careful, and whatever you do, don't work the night shift.